day-to-day life. So Henri, you are going to start us off, I think, with a video clip that you shared with Melissa and I this week around a body camera video that shows an officer interacting with a 5-year-old boy. This happened in Maryland. So do you want me to start by playing the clip and then going from there, or do you want to introduce it in any way?
Briefly, what you're going to hear is an exchange between at least one, but there were a couple of police officers and a 5-year-old that they presumed was being absent from school,
Okay,
hanging
perfect.
out on the street.
Oh my gosh. All right, here we go. Sorry.
How old are you? 5. You feel like you can make your own decisions? Huh? You feel like you can do what you want? Are you an adult? Are you 18? So why are you outside of school? Look at me. Why are you out of school? Why do you have people following you? Huh? I don't care if you don't want to go to school. You do not have that choice. You understand? Well, my life if I tried to do some stuff like that. I would have been beat 9 times before I got home. Don't nobody want to hear that. Ain't nobody even listening. You know why? Because you don't get to do what you want to do. This ain't your world. Don't come back. What I'm going to do is we're going to have you. No what? Sit down. Sit down. I'm gonna wait. You better stop trying to get off this seat. Stop it. Stop it. Oh, and then can you wash them real quick?
So I will share really quickly that they go from the street to the kid in the backseat of the car. You hear him driving him to school. That's when you hear him crying for the first time, and then they actually get him to school, and now they're getting him into offices, and and there are 2 cops involved at that point, a male and a female. Go ahead, Henri.
Yeah, and I may be wrong, but I believe they handcuffed him, or let's put handcuffs on him for some reason. And yes, and I believe this happened a while ago, and the mother is literally filing a lawsuit for obvious reasons. And this was released to kind of support her case of what actually happened. What really struck at me, with this, and as we know, we've been talking about, anti-racism, and I think last week we talked about culture, and today we're going to talk about behavior. And I think we talked about body. And so the idea of here's a 5-year-old Black youth. What didn't happen? Are you okay? Where's your mom? Where's your dad? Is there something we can do to assist you? I mean, the first assumption appeared to be you're doing something wrong, nefarious, and then comes the confrontation. I was listening to another discussion about this, talking about the Black body and assumptions. As you listen to what the officers said, there was a lot of assumptions within that. Do you think you're an adult? Do you think you can make your own decisions? And so on and so forth. And I put that in contrast. And people said, if you encountered a 5-year-old white kid on, let's just say North Park, San Diego, would that have happened? Or would what I implied have happened? Oh my God, where's your mom and dad? Is something wrong? What can I do to assist you? And so that was my reaction to this. And in some sense, another discussion that came out, and just to talk about for lack of a better word, how this has become ingrained in our system. They said the 2 police officers were of mixed race, one black, one white. And so this idea of how you react to the black body, may be more ingrained, regardless of who's the person purporting this, But anyway, that was my reaction.
Your last point there, it made me think about, the concept of dueling consciousness that, we've been talking about throughout this book, that idea that, like you said, because I'm glad you brought up the race of the cops, because in my mind, I'm kind of going, well, how, what's the impact when you consider that one of the cops was African-American or black, a person of color, and Kendi talks about that idea of dueling consciousness, that they're so ingrained, that the misconceptions around the body is so ingrained in this country, that being torn as an African American of understanding that, but also still responding to it the same way that we see white people responding to it.
Well, if you think about, and we may get to, I don't know, I think it's in this chapter where he talks about the speech he wrote, at Stonewall Jackson, and how in retrospect, he realizes the speech was racist.
Yeah.
Because it was supporting all those beliefs and concepts, like this black cop, as he's confronting this 5-year-old. Just on an aside, I heard on the news, Virginia is tearing down the Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson statues. So I said, oh, that's really good.
Well, and I really value the fact that you, brought this clip forward for us to talk about today too. Melissa, people can't see you, obviously, but you're having a strong reaction over there. What are you thinking?
It was my first time hearing it.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't take in Black trauma anymore.
Yeah.
Because I can't.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an empath, so I feel things very deeply.
Yeah.
And to hear a 5-year-old child being spoken to that way, regardless of their race, is heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Absolutely heartbreaking. And I think if that were my child, how do I go forward teaching my child to trust adults, police, anybody that was involved in that situation? It is ridiculous to treat a 5-year-old that way. I don't care what he was doing. I don't care if he was stealing out of a store. I don't care if he was breaking a window. He is 5 years old. What is wrong with us to think that that is acceptable behavior from any adult towards any child? And for anyone listening who may think that this is a one-off, I guarantee you, and I promise you that it is not. I just recently read a story not long ago about a 6-year-old little Black girl who was crying for her father, and the mother, if I get the details right, may not have every detail correctly. Her mother called for some kind of help. She was acting out in some way. Yeah. This little 6-year-old girl got pepper sprayed by police in a police car, and the officer actually said to her, "You're acting like a child." And her response, the reason it stands out to me, her response is, "I am a child." That's what she said to the police. Why does a 6-year-old have to remind any adult that she is a child? Like, it is absolutely mind-boggling to me that this is even a discussion we have to have in any way, shape, or form that we have to have a discussion like this in this country, in this world, is ridiculous to me. And it hurts. It absolutely hurts. I was very emotional hearing it because, like I said, I have read about it, but I purposely had not listened, but I didn't want to change the way this conversation was going to go. So I didn't ask not to hear it, if that makes any sense. I was willing for the sake of this conversation. And my reaction was exactly as I knew it would be, because this is becoming all too common. Like, as I'm hearing that, I'm imagining Trayvon Martin fighting a grown man for his life. I'm imagining Tamir Rice, who is just playing on a playground and gets gunned down because he has a toy gun. Like, it is all too common, and it's happening to Black children way too often.
You know, yeah, sort of like you, Melissa. I had heard the clip, and I had read the story, and that's why, Janice, I said, no, I can describe this. People need to hear this.
I'm glad you did.
There's just something about hearing this that just doesn't come across with reading about this. And you know, sort of like you, my reaction was, oh my God, how would I feel?
Yep.
Or how I have a 6-year-old grandson, and what I could not imagine what that would have done to him.
Yep.
You know, and I agree with you, Melissa. It's regardless of whether he was a white kid, an Asian kid, woman, girl, girl, boy. But I am just so struck, and you know, maybe this is anecdotal, but whenever I've heard about an untoward school encounter, about some untoward bad behavior by an interventionist or the school police or whatever, it always tends to be a Black kid.
Yep.
You know, I cannot recall seeing on the news a story about a white kid who went through this and the parents are suing. I mean, it just always seems to come back to the Black body.
Yep, absolutely right.
And before someone, listens to, hears this and thinks to themselves, well, that's because we only report it when it happens to the Black child, right? The untoward, like you said, school video or what have you. I will say that I would check myself on that assumption, because I think that if it happened to a white child, it not only would it be reported, you'd hear parents screaming even louder, right? I mean, I think that we would have to check that assumption, because I think you're both absolutely right. We see it reported around Black children because that's who this happens to, because white children are treated differently. And we know that even if we just go to something as simple as school discipline data, right? I mean, we know that across the country, there is no place that's immune to the data that shows that Black children are treated very differently, even in a formal structure like school, let alone on the sidewalk with an encounter with the police. So you've introduced chapter 8 for us, Henri, by making the connection to behavior. I'm going to start us off really quickly to say that he defines behavioral racist as someone who is making individuals responsible for the perceived behavior of racial groups and making racial groups responsible for the behavior of individuals. Likewise, of course, the counter to that, behavioral anti-racist, one who is making racial group behavior fictional and individual behavior real. And this 5-year-old is a powerful example of that he wasn't being treated as the individual Black 5-year-old, or white or purple, it doesn't matter. He wasn't being treated as an individual 5-year-old in that moment. He was being treated based on a belief system around a Black body. And he was being held accountable for all the behaviors, right, that have ever gone before him, if you will. So I'll start off our conversation that way. And I will also say that right out of the gate, one of the first things that hit me, and again, it's this notion of dueling consciousness, but the author comes right out of the gate and says, we're going to be talking about the behavior of groups of people and how in this country, Blacks, African Americans, people of color are doing. That's exactly what's happening, right? That they're being held responsible individually for the behavior of a group and vice versa. And right out of the gate, he gives a quote by someone who quotes Dr. King, and he says, this was a common experience for me as a kid, right? As a Black young man, anytime I did not live up to expectations, the messaging for me by other Black people in my surroundings, if you will, was this quote epitomized it. Did Martin Luther King successfully fight the likes of Bull Connor so that we could ultimately lose the struggle for civil rights to misguided or malicious members of our own race? So right out of the gate, that idea that you as an individual are going to make or break us, if you will, as a race because of your behavior. But the assertion is made because that's exactly what happens. So anyway, I'll start us off with there and then go for it, Melissa. You look like you're queued up and ready to go.
Yeah, this chapter, boy, I say this every show, right? I say it every show, but this chapter, this chapter was like, Kendi was looking at me like, you ready? Because this one is for you. I'm a poet, have a couple of CDs out. On my very first CD, I have a poem that I'm so ashamed of today. So I feel him when he talks about this speech. I have a poem called, And You Wonder Why They Call You the N-Word.
Oh, wow.
And in this poem, I go in on Black people for doing things that ultimately feed into the idea that we're less than, we're worse than, but I blame our behavior for us being called that word by others. And when I hear it or see it now, like I skip right over because I'm embarrassed by it. But the truth is, it is a perfect example of what he's talking about in this chapter. This idea that our individual behavior somehow reflects on all of us, and that we are somehow all a representative of the entire race by simply doing things that all humans do. Like all humans do the same, it's behavior. But we have this idea that somehow it's going to make all of us look bad. And Henri and I kind of talked about this a little bit last chapter about this idea that a lot of Blacks have, that they have to prove themselves worthy or show themselves worthy or show themselves accomplished by the clothes we wear and the things. We do that in the way we behave. We've talked about it in previous chapters often, like when we go out with our children, how we make sure our children behave a certain and specific way because we know that others looking at us are already assuming our children are going to behave a different way. And so we have to represent the race better than what they expect of us. So there's a lot swimming around in my head around this chapter, that whole dueling consciousness thing, that whole representative of race thing, that whole, the behaviors that we exhibit simply being human behaviors and not Black people behaviors. So I have a lot of other thoughts. I wanted to really touch on those, something that he said right out of the gate as well, that at first I balked against, which I seem to balk at a lot of what he says until I give it a second. But this idea he was saying that, being like the individual, being individuals. And the reason I balk a little bit is because I don't want people to think, because we've done it on this show as well, that when we speak of the collective, that we're not also understanding that there are individuals within that collective and not every single person is behaving the way we speak. For example, when we say whites or when we say Blacks, we're not saying every single person is exactly the same. And we're not saying that, but we do speak about the collective. And I think that's valid to do so. I think it's valid to speak of the collective as long as there is an understanding there that there's individuals within.
Yeah.
I just kind of wanted to point that out.
No, I think that's an important foundation for the conversation. He does, and Henri mentioned this already, and now Melissa, you've added to it. He tells he builds the learning around his own story. He does that every chapter, and so in this chapter, it really is his experience as a high school student. And out of the gate, he talks about himself as an underperformer, that he could have been better with his grades. He could have been better with how hard he studied. He could have been better. But he, again, to your point about the individual, he comes right out of the gate with now reflecting back and looking on that and thinking, when I performed poorly, and he's very clear to say it's not my parents who sent this message, because my parents always gave me another try. but beyond them and the larger Black community that we existed in, it was that group mentality of you're representing us poorly, you're failing on behalf of all of us, etc. And yet he said, and yet my white friends also could have studied harder. They could have, and their failures and and they could have, had better grades and done all the things. And yet their failures and lack of responsibility weren't then held up as a slight, if you will, against their entire race. And again, I thought that was so important because yes, as a white woman, I don't ever remember having a moment where a success or a failure represented anyone but me. Right. It was never, and frankly, and we talked about this earlier, I can't remember which chapter, and frankly, never a headline that says, white lawyer this, white, doctor discovers. And yet every time, even in the positive, and he talks about how that also is a carrying on of the message, right? That when you on the positive side, always identify a Black person as that who is succeeding, you're also suggesting that they are representing the entire race, and they're not, right? They're representing their own self.
And what's interesting about that, Janice, that really does, when you start talking about that dual consciousness, that's another side of it for Black America, especially. And when a Black person succeeds, you'll notice that most of Black America jumps behind them, roots for them, claims them with so much pride. And it's because of that. It's because it does, in a sense, show the world that we are not what you've said we are. Exactly. And this is a shiny, we're going to show you through Serena Williams. We're going to show you through Michael Jordan. We're going to show you through, Thurgood Marshall. We're going to show you through Eric Holder, whoever, Obama, whoever. We rally because it shows the world that we're not what they say we are, and that we can indeed, and we are capable of great things. Here's an example. And it's crazy because we don't realize, I don't think, that that's what we're doing, that we're perpetuating this idea that we have to prove ourselves some way, but that's what we're doing.
Yep. Henri, what are you thinking?
Oh man, so many things.
I know. It's hard to narrow my focus. I'm not gonna lie. Yeah.
Well, so as I'm listening to this chapter, was an easy one for me, only in that it just captured so much of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But so the thing that jumped out at me is, and I don't know, you, Melissa, might remember this whole idea of credit to their race or credit to your race. I think that is the shackle that has really kind of maintained this kind of ridiculous thinking. The idea that my success or lack of is going to reflect on everyone that's Black, I used to find this fascinating, because, I cross over and I'm in different groups, I'll find myself at an event or a party, and one of the very few, if maybe only, Black persons there. And somehow I have the answers for why Black people feel about X, Y, or Z. I find this whole concept fascinating. And I think, and he says this in the chapter, and I know I've done it. And I was thinking about this, what shifted for me? And it took a long time because I can recall in my life saying things like, well, white people are like this or Black people are like that. And, that automatic grouping of behavior around people, the whole idea of laziness in Black people. That's something that's been perpetuated for a long time. But oh my God, as he said in the book or in the chapter, white people are lazy too. And only because my family's mixed, I married in cross race, I have spent a lot of time with white folks. I have lived with white folks.
Yeah.
I haven't found them to be much different than the Black people in my family.
Right.
Some of them were lazy, had
Yeah.
no issue wanting to succeed, were liars, cheaters, you know. I mean, every behavior that people want to ascribe to Blacks or African Americans, I saw living with white people.
Yeah.
You know, and so this idea of ascribing certain behaviors to a race is totally ridiculous. Now, one of the things I think he does talk about and he keeps coming back to is about testing, standardized testing, and how that evaluates, you know, races. And the bedrock of this, which to me, and it's something I talked to you about at the end of last week, this is about access and resources. You know, he talked about how in the schools, if you look at the population of the school, you can follow the money. There was a great podcast I shared with you some time ago. I think it was Good White People, where he talked about the whole school issue in New York City, where you clearly saw those school districts that lived in areas where there were resources and mostly white students. They had tons of opportunities and resources versus they do a fundraiser. They'd have tons of money coming in versus if you happen to be in a school that was predominantly non-white, your access, your resources were very different. And somehow, based on those things that prepare you for these standardized tests, which somehow evaluate your intelligence, none of that gets factored in when the test comes out. Like, oh, all of a sudden when we ran the race, you, like I keep saying, you had the nice new sneakers and I had the old, you know, Chuck Taylors where the laces are all broken. But yet somehow we're supposed to finish the race equally. Give me a break.
Yep. And I think he did a really good job of demonstrating that when he talked about having the prep course for the test, and how, you know, when it really hit him that I may do better on this test, but not because I'm smarter, because we paid somebody to teach us how to take the test, like what to remember and you know, how to think about it and all of that. And when he said that, I was like, that's a really, really good example of how that's different. You know, when we evaluate these test scores, that's not taken into consideration at all. So the scores don't indicate intelligence at all, in a sense. You know, it's really amazing when you stop and think about how much power or importance we've given these test scores in a child's life, educational life, when those scores aren't indicative really of what we're claiming they're indicative of. And I thought it was interesting as well that he pointed out that it's even those who are trying to do the right thing by standardizing these tests, like, it's not your intent, it's the result that matters. And your intent may have been good, but the result is that it is limiting more than it's helping. So yeah, I thought that was a powerful point.
Well, and he ties that all to the history. So I'm going to back us up for just a second, because you said, Henri, or both of you, actually, most, I think you actually said it, that he had his own epiphany around standardized tests when he was taking prepping for the GREs, and took that class and realized, like, oh wait, I'm just going to have an advantage because now I know how to do it because I had the $1,000 to pay for this class.
Yep.
Oh, by the way, the kids, the young adults who are taking the private tutoring from this same person also going to outscore me because they had the extra money for that. But he talks about even knowing that, even having that epiphany while he's taking that class, didn't change the fact that, like everyone else, he fell victim, if you will, to the attribution effect, to this idea that, you know, I know my score is only higher because I had the money to pay for this course, and yet
but it's still higher.
So I'm walking around like, yep, I'm all that, because look, I got this high score, and the admissions people are going to look at that number and go, wow, he must be really smart, and all the things. And I want to take us back through the history, because I think this is, but I'm going to come to you first, Henri, because I think this is so important for us to understand that history, because he ultimately says the use of standardized tests to measure aptitude and intelligence is one of the most effective racist policies ever devised to degrade Black minds and legally exclude Black bodies. So to your point, Melissa, he actually is arguing it was the intent. Out of the gate, it was the intent. Now, in current times, people have to relearn that because maybe they don't realize that was the intent, but it absolutely was. Henri, I know you wanted to jump in though.
Well, no, and it's interesting you say that. I can go back and forth with, was that the intent, more than quickly we saw what the outcome was and did nothing to change it. And it's interesting because when he talked about this and preparation, I kind of went into my head because, I don't know, maybe in some ways I fell into the trap because I had great SAT scores. Yeah. I went to Stuyvesant High School, and which was, a school you need to literally test to get in New York City. And on some level, I always thought, well, geez, I must be one of those smart Black people, And then I learned some of my friends who also came into the school. Yeah, they got there, but they had to go through this kind of prep thing and summer school course. And it wasn't until I read this chapter, something clicked. All right. And this doesn't take away from, let's say, my own abilities.
Sure, of course.
But what was different? So first off, my family valued education. So that was one component. But in New York City, very early on, I was the subject of the desegregation. Okay. So from first grade, I was bused from that community school that he talks about as poorly resourced and doesn't have the same funding, over to the West Bronx, where I was the only Black kid in the school.
Yeah.
Standardized tests, I was ready because they were ready. They prepared them, and I'm in the class, I was prepared too. And, so when I think back, I didn't need a prep test to teach me how to take the test. I was already prepared because I went through the learning and the education, as everyone else. And it was just interesting to me, when I heard this, and how you even feed into some of this. But literally, I say all this to come back to standardized tests. We know what they are. Now there's enough data and research to really show they, in a disparaging way, do not really represent intelligence more than the lack of resource, access, and preparation of certain students and their ability to effectively compete, And if we didn't know this, we wouldn't see this movement now to do away with SATs and GREs in terms of college applications and looking at other skills and attributes to talk about one's ability to be successful.
Well, and with that, I think that's why I feel like doing a quick run through of the history piece is really important, because it informed my thinking so much, because like you said, we've been doing that now, right? Those are the things that are making the news, getting rid of those big tests, et cetera. And there are plenty of folks across this country who don't understand the core of that movement. And don't understand, this kind of basic idea that it could be the test, not the people. And that is what those movements are about, a final acknowledgement that it's the test, not the people. So he backs up to say, he's basically, he's making an argument for shifting away from this idea of an achievement gap and embracing the idea of an opportunity gap, which you are starting to hear in the field of education. It is not a loud enough cry yet. And I was, in fact, just in a conversation yesterday with some colleagues, and they were referring to a source that's a few years old and was using that terminology. And I was really happy to have a colleague jump right in and say, well, let's not think about it in terms of an achievement gap. It's an opportunity gap. And just a reminder, but that's unusual. It's not commonplace yet. It needs to be. So we're going to have to keep pushing and fueling that conversation. But he says the use of standardized tests to measure aptitude and intelligence is one of the most effective racist policies. I think I shared that already. And he ties that then to saying this, that the acceptance of an academic achievement gap is just the latest method of reinforcing the oldest racist idea that Black intellectualism is inferior. The idea of an achievement gap means there's a disparity in academic performance between groups of students. Implicit in that idea is that academic achievement, as measured by statistical instruments like test scores and dropout rates, is the only way to actually measure how a child is achieving. There's an even more sinister implication, he goes on to say, in Achievement Gap Talk, that disparities in academic achievement accurately reflect disparities in intelligence among racial groups. Intellect, then, is the linchpin of behavior, and the racist idea of the achievement gap is the linchpin of behavioral racism. And I wanted to make that point because I could see how some folks, now having read the chapter, would go, wait, how did we go about talking from behavior to achievement gaps? How did we make that connection? That's the connection, right? That the idea of an achievement gap in this country, which is so significant, is the linchpin then of behavioral racism. And so making that connection was really important. He says that to believe in a racial hierarchy is to believe in a racist idea. And of course, an achievement gap is a smack you in the face example of identifying a racial hierarchy, if you will. So let me just really quickly, Henri, I'm going to just run through a couple of pieces of the history, and then I'm going to come right to you, okay? So the history begins way back in 1869 when you look at Francis Galton is who he calls out, who basically was the first person to publicly say that average intellectual standard of the Negro race is some 2 grades below our own. Now, the problem with him, of course, is that he actually didn't even have any evidence of that. He had no assessment that was being used to even back that up. Not that we're saying an assessment is a good thing. But flash forward then to 1905 when Francis Binet and Theodore Simon succeeded by developing the original IQ test that we all are very familiar with now. We know that that test was given first during World War I to a whole big group of soldiers. And what they did through that testing was basically say aptitude means natural ability. So like he says, eugenists, they believe that the SAT would reveal the natural intellectual ability of the white people. That was their motive, having an assessment that would prove that white people were intellectually superior. And I think, again, that's not something we hear when we think about that IQ test. As I said, it's not something we used to hear. It's something that we're starting to hear more and more. From there, he flashed forward to the 60s, and it was there in the 60s that we actually started to, again, begin to understand that genetics does not play a role in this. And so that began to kind of steer that conversation a little bit. The 60s, keep that in mind, you guys, the 60s, when we kind of had to go, okay, hold on, if genetics doesn't play a role, if science is starting to disprove that, which by the way, we know now from his walk through history, it was in the 2000s before we actually got people to finally agree that there was no genetic difference. But essentially it was at that point that we began to realize that, and we started pushing the message that the gap that was being presented wasn't about an individual person's intellectual ability. However, assimilationists at that point, and then I'm going to pause and come to you, Henri. Assimilationists at that point, this is the 60s again, started then embracing the idea, well, it's not that individually they're not as smart, but their environments are holding them back. So now we've said it's not necessarily that person, but it is the culture, tying to last week's conversation, that kid is growing up in that's holding them back. So still blaming it on the people, right? Go ahead, Henri.
Well, no, I was just talking about this. It just reminds me of how embedded this thinking really is. Mm-hmm. Intelligence versus innate natural ability. And to this day, and because, my experience, there was this false belief, and, you may have heard, oh, Asians are good at math, right. Like somehow if I'm born an Asian, I'm going to be a math genius, are you kidding me? Or any other behavior that we've ascribed to, a certain race, but this whole idea of intelligence versus innate ability, you're just born that way. I agree with you. That belief is just rooted in perpetuating continually these racist ideas. But, I want to go back to something that I think he's really trying to bring across in this book too. Yeah, we got these ideas, but what's more harmful is we have policies and systems that support and perpetuate these ideas.
Yes.
So as we're talking about intelligence and innate ability, and I think he talked about this in the book, let's go back to education, Bush and Obama, with all these student initiatives to increase standardized testing as to somehow that's going to make the difference.
Yeah.
And so to bring this even closer to something practical, my daughter's a fourth grade teacher in New York City. I have watched her and listened to her over the years talk about the dilemma that she and many others have of teaching to the test.
Yes.
Versus resourcing the education that the students truly need.
Right.
And maybe doing away with the test, because I could teach you to the test and you'll pass. Does that mean you've actually learned the skill? And it just keeps coming back to me of the standardized testing. It's embedded in policy. It's how the school, how teachers are evaluated, how funding is allocated. So we know in these poor school districts, because of you already do poorly, you're teaching to the test, you're not going to necessarily do well. Does that equate to then the resources and the opportunities you're going to get? Because then there's a presumption, well, you're not intelligent, why should we fund you? It's like a vicious cycle to me. And I guess the best thing we can do is at least undo this belief that somehow intelligence is tied to race or innate ability. And as you say, Janice, this is about opportunity.
Yep.
And I honestly always believe if we gave every child the same and equal opportunity, we would be surprised in terms of how they would do in terms of achievement. No, we wouldn't be surprised. We know how they do. They would all do well.
Exactly. Well, and we see, and that's in my day job, we study deeply high performing systems around the world. And one of the key things that we see happening in those systems from birth, not even from pre-K, but from birth all the way up for children, is this idea that the kids who need the most get the most. It's this idea that we have to stop one size fits all funding, which, by the way, isn't actually what's happening, as you said, Henri, because I know I can move to a different area with a higher, income, average income, and et cetera. That translates to better schools because of local funding and the way local funding works in this country. And I can get a different result for my kid just by simply doing that, right? So we know that, but I want to kind of, you commented about the history. You brought us back to the or up to, if you will, the current, because he does talk about both No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top, Bush and Obama, and those efforts. And here's what's interesting. He kind of does here what he did back in a previous chapter where he said, when we talked about race, and he said, I know your instinct is to stop identifying race because now we know race is a social construct. So why even identify my race on a form, for example? And then he said, but we're not there yet. We actually can't get to the point where we don't identify race until we fix the system, because for now we actually need that data by race to show that the system is broken. It's true with the standardized testing piece, right? As long as you're going to do standardized testing, you have to report it out by groups like this with, Blacks and kids who have disabilities and Latino, et cetera, because that's the information we need to show that the system is broken. But what we can do right now is help people understand that the actual testing that we're using, that standardized test model, is not an accurate reflection of the actual intellectual ability. And I think we're starting to embrace that, as you said. We're starting to dispel the idea around using an SAT, et cetera. So here's what he says. And I think these questions are so important, and I've written them down in a separate document because I want to start surfacing them in the work that I do with school districts. Lots of districts right now, by the way, trying to think about how do we improve the opportunity gap? How do we bring more equity to this notion of an opportunity gap? But he asked some key questions because outside of just this idea around achievement scores, he says this, but what if all along these well-meaning efforts at closing the achievement gap, which we've been throwing a lot of money at for the last 30 years, have been opening the door to racist ideas? What if different environments lead to different kinds of achievement rather than different levels of achievement? What if the intellect of a low testing Black child in a poor Black school is different from, not inferior to, the intellect of a high testing white child in a rich white school? What if we measured intelligence by how knowledgeable individuals are about their own environments? What if we measured intellect by an individual's desire to know? What if we realize the best way to ensure an effective educational system is not by standardizing our curricula and tests, but by standardizing the opportunities available to all students? Go ahead, Melissa.
And that's what I was getting at when I was speaking about intent.
Yes.
Not that I don't think there is a nefarious intent behind some of this way of thinking, but that, you know, even those who are well-meaning, like the money we're throwing at trying to close this achievement gap, is your intent may have been to do that, but all you've really done is widen it. All you've really done is made it worse, because your intent wasn't the thing. As Henri said, it's the results. And when we see that the results aren't working, we still aren't making the adjustments necessary to fix whatever it is that's broken. And so I think that's exactly what the part that I was thinking of when I was speaking of intent. I think that it's important to know, as you said, though, that there is indeed some nefarious intent behind a lot of what is deemed, you know, certain behaviors attributed to certain people. Going back to what Henri said about laziness, for example. Yeah. I don't know how you bring an entire race of people to this country to build it from the ground up, to work the land, to build it, to map out the streets, and then deem Black people lazy. That's on purpose. That was an intent. It was then to take away the accomplishment. So I think we absolutely have to be aware of both sides of that coin. We have to be very aware of, yeah, they do this on purpose so that we can continue to justify the oppression of people of color. And we also, you know, we do it sometimes non-intentionally. By trying to fix a broken system, we sometimes make that system worse with these tests and things of that nature. So, yeah.
So
I want to go back to something you said, Janice, you know, and I'm not sure if I heard this correctly. Okay. You know, the idea of we fund where the need is most, or something about.
We don't do that. That's what we see in high performing systems. We don't do it. That's one.
Okay. Because what I wanted to make clear is, as I've described, if that was true, then these inner city schools would be getting a hell of a lot more money.
That's exactly.
But you know, as you were talking about this chapter and what he was talking about, and it just made me think about people learn differently. You know, the traditional sit in a desk in a classroom doesn't work for everybody.
Yeah.
That's right.
The ultimate goal of education and information and knowledge may be different for everybody. But as I'm listening to you and his description, all of a sudden what jumped out at me is, and I don't know if any of you saw this, it was a documentary. They talk about the new school in New York. And it's the schools they built to what I'll call accommodate the non-traditional learner.
Okay.
You know, there's no desk, you know, you sit around in groups and and we chat, we debate. The whole idea was an educational environment that will accommodate the difference in how people learn and getting away from traditional learning. Well, lo and behold, who goes to the new school? Tuition, I think, is about $40,000 a year. know, but this comes back to my point of even when we think of a educational construct that we believe is more effective and efficacious in terms of educating our kids, it all comes back to funding, resource, and opportunity.
Exactly. So be thinking about, we're going to start to wrap up. So be thinking about your kind of final point and or your action items for our listeners. And I'm going to build off of what you just said, Henri, to say, you know, it's interesting because clearly he's making an argument that we have to continue to focus on opportunity gap, stop focusing on achievement gap, and really rethink how we're using standardized tests. All of those are true. And in that, he even says, you know, to not, in that series of questions I just shared with everybody, to move away from a standardized curricula. And yet it's kind of like the whole point again early on about continuing to identify your race. We actually have to have a standardized curricula until we start to fix the system. Because without that, and by the way, we don't have a standardized curricula. That's why I'm making this argument. Right now we have Common Core standards, yes, but not every state, every district, every school is actually accessing those standards in the same way. And until we do, right? So that's kind of in my mind, that's the minimum point that we have to get at. We have to get at that point so that every student does have access to those standards. And then maybe we can get to a point where we're sophisticated enough to be able to really think about the questions he asked and think to ourselves, gosh, how do we actually build learning environments that do that? So I wanted to kind of make that point. And I think that a couple of action items that I want to offer for folks, you know, first off, I really, of course, as an educator, I really value that he brought this chapter around behavior to this, right? To this idea of an achievement gap and standardized testing, and then talks about how it's a linchpin, because I wouldn't have thought about academic achievement, if you will, and behavior in the same context if he hadn't made that connection for me. And again, we started this conversation with behavior in a different place. So the whole kind of broad swath of behavior is the important thing to take away from it. But for our listeners, I have two quick action items. The first one would be just to think about what we talked on early on in the hour about this idea of Black behavior or white behavior or what have you, and catch yourself in the moment. Again, catch yourself in the moment. Whether you're watching something on the news, whether you're experiencing something in your own day-to-day life, catch yourself when you catch yourself thinking about somebody's behavior in terms of the color of their skin, and ask yourself that question, that kind of investigative question of why am I having that thought, and kind of be deliberate about backing it up. It's a similar action item I think that I put out there each time. And the second one is larger than yourself, and that is this notion of opportunity gap. If you've been listening to this conversation, and you're either having a really kind of adverse reaction to it because you're so bought into the idea of achievement gap and so you can't imagine shifting it, or the notion about opportunity gap really is starting to kind of make you go, yeah, that's exactly right. Explore it further, right? We're going to need a groundswell of folks, parents, community members, business owners, educators, of course, yelling from the highest rooftops, this is an opportunity gap issue. And now what do we do about it? In order to shift a mental model that has existed for hundreds of years in this country. So those are my two action items. Henri, I'm going to come to you next, and Melissa, you're going to have the final word.
Oh, cool. All right. Yeah, you kind of set this up for me because as I said, this chapter just was so interesting because this whole intersect of behavior, schools,
yeah,
and how it is perpetuated, you know, by these beliefs about intelligence and innate ability. And yet we see these disparities in treatment, resources, and opportunities going forward. But you know, and I'll end on this. You know, if nothing else, one of the things that was really helpful to me, and I'm sorry it came to me late, when I went to college, I wanted to be a sociologist, you know, which was studying populations and people. And eventually in grad school, I shifted into public health. And one of the things I learned, and certainly as I studied and then wrote papers and stuff, is nothing's 100%. You could never generalize to the whole population. and that's one of the things that kind of helped me to see, not all white people, not all Black people, not all Asians, and I think if people could just think about that, nothing's 100%, and let's please stop ascribing 100% behavior to any particular race or culture or things like that. And then I'll end on this one. I was so happy to hear this. As you folks may know, this major, we've been talking about push to suppress voting.
Right.
And this week, the folks who have literally come out and have called it for what it is, and it is Georgia and other states truly doing nothing more than trying to suppress the vote of Black people. And what's more important is the support of Major League Baseball.
Yes.
And companies, major CEOs are literally saying, if this is what you do, this is what we would choose to do.
Yep.
And I think it is stuff like that that begins to undo some of what we're talking about, because unfortunately, the only thing sometimes that seems to matter is the dollar.
That's it. And the voices to control the dollar. So thank you for bringing that up, Henri, because that has been a powerful development this week, and we're going to see how it continues to grow. So thank you for that. Melissa, what you got?
It's funny because I actually want to piggyback off of what both of you have said. So Janice, what you said about catching oneself in the moment, I think is great. But I also think that we can do it proactively as well. I think in order to catch yourself in the moment, you have to be proactive in knowing what your biases are, what your beliefs are. So I think we always talk about what can I do? You can take a few minutes and sit down and question your own thoughts and challenge your own thoughts. What behaviors do you attribute to entire groups of people, and where did they come from, and how do you break them? And have you perpetuated them amongst your family and your friends? Do you see them? Do you challenge them? And if not, do. That's my first. My second is based on what Henri said, and I'm so glad he brought that up about the Major League Baseball taking their business out of Georgia. I think we have to be more diligent and more aware of who we support and what they support. So if our dollars are going to the Major League, Baseball, and they're leaving, give them more dollars. And if the ones who are not taking action or who are doing the opposite of what we want to see, don't give them any. Because you're absolutely right when you say that the dollar speaks. And that's something that I think overall we need to be aware of, but absolutely in the Black community. That is something that we have to start putting more into practice. I think about the NFL when I say this, and how they blackballed Colin Kaepernick, how they wouldn't support anything that had to do with his attempts to speak up about police brutality. And then when the George Floyd thing happened, when the George Floyd murder happened, then all of a sudden they wanted to be pro-Black and let's now, have all of these Black initiatives. And so, but we continue to support the NFL. And I know that it's convoluted and complicated and all of that because we have Black players that we want to support and blah, 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 blah. But at the end of the day, if we had withdrawn more of our support, if we had withdrawn our dollars, we probably would have gotten a different response a lot earlier. And so that goes for all of us, but specifically even more so to Black America, to keep in mind and be cognizant and purposeful about where our dollars go, because where our dollars go make a difference. It makes a statement. So those two things would be my action suggestions for this week.
Appreciate that. Appreciate both of you being a part of this conversation every week. You guys aren't showing up because anybody's paying you. You're showing up because the learning is important and the conversation is important. And so I'm going to just very quickly let folks know that next week we're going to dive into chapter 9 of Kendi's book, and that is around color. Because if it's not complicated enough to really be thinking about this conversation in terms of white and Black, let's add this layer, which, by the way, I'm going to stop myself from talking about it, but I had no idea, right? And so color is going to get us into the conversation around the disparities or the inequities that exist between light people and dark people. And as a Black person or African American person in this country, how, and again, it's not enough that you have to think about white people. Now you also have to think about those layers kind of within the context of people of color. So we're going to look forward to that next week. We'll see everybody between now and then. Like, listen, share, subscribe, do all the things to get this podcast in front of the people in your world who you know would benefit from it. And with that, we'll see you next week and we'll get to it.